For those of you who loved the histamine, MCAS, mast cell activation syndrome episode with Michelle Shapiro, finally, you are getting the follow-up to that episode. Not with Michelle just yet. We are doing our nervous system episode, which is coming probably next month, but with Taylor Goldberg, who is a hypermobility coach and chiropractor who specializes and has dedicated her career to supporting patients with hypermobility within their bodies and joints, specifically hypermobility that is leading to severe histamine and MCAS flares. Because for a lot of us, as you learned in that episode, hypermobility of the body and the joints is a factor and could be why you're not feeling better if you have histamine issues. So this is kind of like the physical aspect follow-up to that episode. If you listen to that episode and you've identified that you're someone who struggles very clearly with histamine and mast cell issues, and you're starting to maybe manage that through watching your intake of high histamine foods, regulating your nervous system, working with antihistamine nutrients and plants like nettle or quercetin, you may also be wondering why, even with all of those strategies, you're still having flares, especially after you do really intense exercise, or you're sitting jammed up in a car for many hours and your joints are all cranked and hyperextended and funky, and why so many of your symptoms, histamine-wise, anxiety-wise, racing heart-wise, brain fog-wise, seem to correlate to when your physical body is overextended, or when you're trying a new exercise routine and should be feeling better, but actually feel 10 times worse. And that is because hypermobility is a thing. It is a condition, HEDS. There's many different types of it, which we're going to cover in this episode. But if you are someone who was very bendy and flexible as a kid, and everyone was like, how are you double jointed? How can you move your legs like that? Oh my goodness, this is so cool that you're so flexible. You may be someone who's struggling with hypermobility within your joints, ligaments, connective tissue, all the things. And while it's a cool party trick, it can actually create a lot of stress on the body, again, specifically when it comes to histamine issues. So it's something that needs to be sort of managed and something that we need to be informed about so that those of us with hypermobility can learn to move and exercise differently so that we don't hyperextend and send ourselves into a flare. This is the number one thing that has helped me with my own histamine issues after finding out that that was a part of my puzzle. I started seeing a physical therapist who specializes in hypermobility and had to quite literally retrain me on how to do something as simple as a squat so that I could activate and use the right muscles. Because when you're hypermobile and when your shoulder like can stretch to the moon or like dislocate or whatever, and you can quite literally shoulder through things, you will learn to basically use your joints and your connective tissue to do certain exercises or movements or weight-bearing activities instead of activating the right stabilizer muscles. Because since you can bend your shoulder like that and can pick up a kettlebell with your entire shoulder joint, why would you have to use your hamstrings and your legs? Your body can just overcompensate. And so working with this physical therapist, she has, again, completely retrained my body. She has shown me how to activate the right muscle groups when I'm doing these very simple activities like picking something up off the floor or doing a sit-up or whatever it is. And my body, my inflammation levels have completely changed because I'm no longer constantly throwing things out of whack and hyperextending. And I'm starting to actually see and feel muscle changes in certain parts of my body, like my posterior chain, my glutes, my hamstrings, my calves, that I had a very hard time activating and exercising in the past. And I feel so much more stable and my posture is better and I'm able to stand and exercise for longer periods of time because I'm finally starting to move with the new muscle memory of relearning how to live in a hypermobile body. So all of this to say, again, if you're someone who was very flexible growing up and you always have random body pains and you can't stand for long and you're always leaning on things and you're having, weird tightness and pain in your shoulders and your neck and your jaw all the time, and you feel like your other muscles don't activate the way that other people's do, and all the things, this is a great episode for you to listen to, especially if you have histamine issues. And Taylor is just wonderful. I don't want to give too much away because this is a long episode that's jam-packed, but we're starting off strong, and being a chiropractor, basically the first thing I'm asking her is chiropractic medicine a pseudoscience? And it's a really, really refreshing / fascinating take, because Taylor kind of dispels the myths that unfortunately a lot of chiropractors are taught in school, which is that you can just crack someone's back and realign them, and all they need is chiropractic work 3 times a week and they'll be totally fine. And that is so not the case. However, chiropractic alignments can temporarily make someone more comfortable and relieve pain to the point where they can exercise and strengthen stabilizer muscles in their back and throughout their body so that they have less pain in the long term, because they are focusing on strength and realignment through their musculature. So it can be a tool to help you do the things that you need to do with less pain more frequently and more effectively, but it is not the tool and the cure in itself. And as she says, there is no way to realign your spine. There is just no way to do it. And there's so much misinformation out there when it comes to chiropractic. And I think it, again, can be very helpful for certain things, especially short term, especially combined with training and sports medicine. But as a standalone, I think there's a lot of overpromising, and people get into situations where they're going to a chiropractor very often and it gets very expensive, and it may not actually be the best use of your funds. So that was cool. We're going to start off there. Then we're going to start off talking about hypermobility and histamine, and she's just going to go off and explain everything you want to know as a follow-up to the histamine episode. I've talked enough, so let's get into this. And Taylor is a genius, and I know that you guys will love her as much as I do. I'll see you next week. Okay, are you ready?
We feel each other's emotions.
It's everything. It's living my life intentionally.
That's the message, right?
Absolutely. There's no difference between our mental health and our physical health. It's the same exact thing.
And without further ado, let's get juicy. Taylor Goldberg, welcome to What's the Juice podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for traveling all the way here to be our new resident chiropractic expert for all of the humans that are hypermobile and struggling with chronic pain and don't know what the heck to do.
Anytime. I love being in New York.
So can you tell us a little bit about yourself? You're a chiropractor. And I know that when people hear that word nowadays, we were just talking about this off camera, it can feel a little scammy, but you don't practice like a chiropractor. What didn't sit right with you about your schooling, and how do you do things differently?
Yeah, definitely. So let's go back before chiropractic school. I went to Florida State, go Noles, and I was pre-med at FSU.
Same.
Went abroad, studied.
Not at FSU,
Pre-med, yep. Studied in Spain and took an alternative medicine class in Spain. And this was after I took the MCAT, after I did all the prereqs, did my application for med school, everything. And I came home from Spain and I'm hysterically crying on the phone with my mom. And I'm like, I don't know what I want to do with my life, but I know I don't want to go to med school because of the way they practice medicine in Spain. It was just more of what I wanted. So I had no idea what I wanted. And then somehow I was sitting actually at the dinner table with my sorority sisters, and someone was like, why don't you look into chiropractic? And I was like, okay. Didn't really know much about it, honestly. Didn't realize the scammy nature of it or anything like that, and just applied. And I was like, you know what? The universe is telling me to do this. I'm going to just do it. So ended up at chiropractic school. That was a very interesting experience, to say the least. A lot of weird narratives that I was not vibing with. And I also knew I was hypermobile when I went to chiropractic school, which is very, very rare. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. And I knew that I didn't really want my neck to be adjusted every single day, which as a chiropractic student, that's kind of what happens. Regardless, I ended up graduating, ended up taking an associate position in Colorado where I live now, and I worked in person for a year. And that's really where I figured out what I don't want to be as a chiropractor. The practice I worked at is your very typical, we call them chiropractic mills. They practice in a way that you have 5-minute adjustments. I'm seeing 50 people a day. It's rack 'em and crack 'em. There's no real history taking, there's no real evaluation, and there's no real rapport built with the patients in that type of model. And I just don't see how that is helpful for humans. And so I knew I did not want to do that anymore, and ended up reaching out to some people I saw on social media, practicing in a way that I thought looked evidence-based, if you will. And so I reached out to them. They told me how they started, and that's kind of what I did. I reached out to somebody called the Honey Badger Project, which is a group for chiropractors or PTs who want to practice in an evidence-based way. And now we also started a chiropractic mentorship called Clinical Concepts that does the same for chiropractors specifically.
Okay, first of all, I love hearing more about your journey. What a long road, and yet you're so young. So thank you for your dedication to continuing education and finding like the right way to practice that felt good to you so that you can be a provider of the future. I have several questions. Number one, how do they practice in Spain that stuck out to you? Like, what's different about their medical system?
Everything in Spain is different. Everything in Europe is different. It's not about hustle and bustle. It's also not so much about diagnosis. It's a lot about holistic, looking at the whole body instead of, oh, your foot hurts, we're only going to look at your foot. Oh, your back hurts, we're going to see what's misaligned in your back. They really take a full body approach, and they incorporate things like yoga and breath work into their Western medicine practices, which I just didn't see here. Also, the lifestyle of Spain, I had this envision in my head that medical school, and I was probably not far off, was going to be very like hustle and bustle. And I just didn't want that anymore. I don't know why I thought chiropractic school would be different. It wasn't, but I thought it would have been. And so that's kind of also part of it, my own lifestyle journey within it.
How did your own experience of physical symptoms and maybe chronic pain that came with hypermobility, which is what this episode is about, we'll define that in a sec, but how did your own lived experience of a body that seemed to have a lot more challenges than the people around you play into your decision to not go further with Western medical school?
Yeah, a big part. And it also, same thing with chiropractic, which is why I practice virtually now as well. But a big part of it was I can't sit for an extended period of time without pain. I can't stand for an extended period of time without pain. I knew that was going to play a role if I wanted to be a surgeon one day or anything in that realm. It was going to be harder. And I'm not saying that people who are hypermobile can't be MDs or surgeons or anything like that, but there's going to be accommodations needed, and you are going to have to work harder than the general population. That's just the reality.
Was there also this element of like Western medicine doesn't seem to have answers for people like me, and that's kind of why you went into something alternative, quote unquote, like chiropractic?
Yeah, that was a big part of it. I think I got misled by that as well, and I think we'll talk a little bit about that too. I think we think that Western medicine is the bad guy, if you will, functional medicine or whatever you want to call it, alternative medicine is the good guy. I think we just need to get out of that all or nothing mindset in every single aspect of life. Yeah. We can all work together. There is no bad guy. We need both. We need both, and we need to work together. And that, in my opinion, is one of the biggest flaws in our healthcare system right now, is that we are so divided and we're against each other when we could just be working together.
Wow. So I really love this take. It's something that keeps coming up with our guests in terms of like the lack of balance and the lack of like validity and answers on both sides. We were just saying a lot of people go to functional medicine practitioners and also get hit with scammy tests and millions of supplements and all these things. Yep. What were some of those scammy aspects of chiropractic school that you just called out? Because I think a lot of people have gone to a chiropractor and been like, why is this dude pressing my hand down and saying that I need 3 standard process supplements?
So that is called AK, applied kinesiology, what you're speaking about specifically. There is no scientific backing to AK. There is no scientific backing to muscle testing for specific supplements, or really for anything besides, is that muscle strong or weak? Are we having a nerve innervation issue? That muscle testing is great for, and we need that, but it does not help you figure out what sensitivities you have to food or what sensitivities you have to medications. And if you keep going to a provider, this is my biggest piece of advice to anybody. If you are going to a provider for longer than a year, and your reason for going is so that you don't get worse, not because you're actually getting better, please change providers. That's the biggest scam I think chiropractors, from my opinion, portray, is that you have to get adjusted for the rest of your life. If you don't, you're going to be not healthy. Your immune system's not, your innate intelligence, whatever words they use to scam you.
That good old innate intelligence in the spine.
Exactly, which is not how anatomy works, but we can get into that. But regardless, it's really interesting. When I worked in my in-person practice, that was a question I would ask patients a lot, is why do you keep coming in? Because this practice had patients for 10,
when you were
20
working
years.
at the scammy
Yeah,
chiropractic
exactly.
practice.
Yeah. And I would ask, why do you keep coming to see me? Why do you keep coming back? And their answer was, well, I'm scared I'm going to get worse if I don't. Not I'm helping you, not I'm getting better, not because I see value in this, not because it's helping me reach my goals. Those are valid reasons to see a provider. If we're scaring people and creating urgency to get people through the door, that's not a good model. That's not healthcare. That's just marketing and making money off of people's vulnerabilities. And that's the biggest issue I have with chiropractic.
I think that's going to give people a lot of validity to the instinctive feelings that they've had around the field. I think for me, in my experience, I had gone to several chiropractors in my past, right? In my crunchy past. And I would go and they'd be like, all right, you got to come in 2 or 3 weeks for this. Look at this S curve in your spine. We got to get these subluxations moved, release that innate intelligence. Isn't your digestion so much better after you get an adjustment? And I will say, I did feel better after the adjustment.
And you will.
And I want to talk about why that is. Okay. But then I also would find that the next day I was, if anything, a little bit more uncomfortable and felt like I needed more and more of the chiropractic adjustments. And I couldn't compare that to baseline of like, do I actually feel better before I came in here? So what is the benefit of getting, quote, adjusted? Why do you temporarily feel better? Is there ever a place for that? And are there different ways of getting adjusted where one is maybe better than the other?
Yes, absolutely. I want to preface this. I'm speaking to the general population right now, not the hypermobile population, because they do have differences for this specific topic. For the general population, there is benefits for short-term relief and short-term increase in range of motion for getting an adjustment by a chiropractor. And for some people, for the really hypomobile population, my boyfriend would be included in that, when they have not a lot of range of motion, it can be really, really helpful to get that short-term increase in range of motion and then utilize that in your rehab to create those neural pathways and to create that brain-body connection so that you can do more long-term. That, to me, is where adjustments can be great. And I think there's huge, huge value in them for that specifically. What they don't do is create innate intelligence. We're not moving bones. So what's actually happening when you hear that crunch, when you hear that noise, we have fluid around all of our joints. It's called synovial fluid. And anytime there's movement in that fluid, bubbles will form. What you're hearing is those bubbles forming in that joint fluid. Mm-hmm. It's not moving bones. It's not aligning anything. It's just creating a short-term increase in range of motion and a short-term, for some people sometimes, pain relief, which can be extremely beneficial to a lot of people. Keyword here, though, is short-term. So
is that because fluid is kind of like pressing on something that's causing pain? So when you're moving the fluid, you're getting relief?
So there's different reasons for why you get some of the pain relief. Have you ever heard of the pain gate cycle or the pain gate theory? So there's nociception, which is our actual brain's interpretation of pain, and everything comes from the brain. The brain tells our body everything. It tells our body how to
That's
function.
Hot. That's cold. Move this muscle. Yeah,
exactly. And so when we get a different sensation into those mechanoreceptors into our body, there's a lot of different reasons for the pain gate theory, but it basically halts some of those pain sensations and signals to the brain so that your brain is like, oh, okay, I can stop right now. She's safe.
So it's not because a bone is moving and a subluxation is being corrected.
No. And
you were taught in chiropractic school that subluxations are the cause of pain, digestive issues, yada, yada, yada. And just correcting people's subluxations, A, can happen, and B, is the cure for a lot of diseases. And that's not true.
So luckily and interestingly, schools are starting to stop using that verbiage. And my school, I went to UWS, is a quote unquote evidence-based chiropractic school. Every school is going to be different, but we stopped using the word subluxation, and boards has actually stopped using that word as well. Why other chiropractors are still using that word, I'm not sure, but it is hands down 100% validated that chiropractors do not move bones and that subluxation theory is a myth. It is validated.
So if you have an S curve in your spine, even if you can see a little something out of alignment on a scan, an X-ray, chiropractic is not going to change that. That's just, unfortunately, how your spine develops, sister.
Let's talk about the X-rays in a second. But prior to that, do you know how much force it takes for a bone to actually move?
Oh, I didn't even think of that.
like way more than a human being is capable of providing. It's like 200 pounds. Don't quote me on that, but it's something crazy. It's way more than a human being is capable of applying.
Okay.
So just by that nature alone, we're not capable of moving bones. We're
so
just
you're not capable of changing alignment,
No,
which
we're
is
not.
originally what's taught. You
Correct.
are capable of moving synovial fluid
Yep.
and creating temporary pain relief so
Yep.
that person can maybe do an exercise that day, right? They can have a more effective workout. They can maybe build muscle in areas that can lead to long-term improvements in pain relief.
Exactly.
So as always, the truth is somewhere in the middle. It's not that chiropractic care has no benefit. It's just understanding what it's doing and leveraging that temporary window of improvement of motion and pain, where you can employ other strategies like strengthening the body and aligning, quote unquote, the body that way so that you can live a better pain-free life.
Absolutely. And on that note, the narrative that your chiropractor gives to you has a huge role in how we're going to feel. So when you went to the chiropractor and you felt better afterwards, a lot of it probably has to do with him or her saying, you're going to feel better after this. This is going to make you feel better. As human beings, when we hear that from somebody in power and somebody that we trust, we believe that more and our body does happen to feel better. And I think a lot of the times chiropractors, when I have arguments or debates with chiropractors who are on the opposite side of the spectrum as my thinking, they'll say, but I have so many anecdotal evidence of people feeling better after an adjustment. How can you say a subluxation isn't real? How can you say an adjustment doesn't fix everything? We have to look at other factors. What environment have you set up for the person in front of you? What words are you using when they're in your office? What have you told them about their condition? Did you tell them that this is going to help them? Did you tell them that this is going to make them feel better? Because they're probably going to believe that, and it's probably going to be true while they're in your office. There's also an expectation that they want to make you happy. The patients want to make the provider happy. That's just a human natural thing. So there's a lot of reasons for those anecdotal experiences. And I think that more chiropractic schools, really, this goes higher up than just chiropractors in general, need to start teaching those things, which is exactly what we do in clinical concepts.
I would pose that there may even be an element of the physical touch that's
Absolutely.
helpful. I mean,
Absolutely.
we're seeing more and more studies come. I saw a study yesterday about how patting a basketball player on the back after they had just missed a free throw actually increases their chances of making the next free throw because there's such a potent stress relieving effect of even a pat.
Yeah.
So imagine someone's like working on your body, touching your body lovingly. Like that has to play a role too.
Oh, 1,000%.
And I love body work and I love chiropractic. There is a place. I go to a chiropractor sometimes when I was about to say subluxate my lower back.
Proud of you for
a chiropractor sometimes when I hyperextend / have a spasm in my lower back, right? Let's say. Sometimes like when I'm deadlifting or like I'm just moving my lower back wrong, I strain it. I'll go to this guy, I love him, Dr. Elon Michael, if you guys are in Westchester, and he will, yes, kind of crack my back a little, which maybe I'll chat with him about, but he will also use a TENS unit, a TENS machine with electrostimulation to release some of that spasming. He'll use heat. He'll use a Theragun. He'll just even like massage a bit with his hands. And I always feel like that stuff is why I'm going to him and is helping me a lot more than even like the back cracking, even though, yes, the back cracking that day relieves some of that pain. So at least I can take a walk that day.
Yeah.
And then the walk often helps the lower back.
Exactly.
So there's a time and a place. He's part of my pain
100%.
relief care plan. I do love him.
Yeah, 100%. And all of the things that you just described are what we're going to umbrella passive modalities. There are so many passive modalities we can utilize. Adjustments are just one of those passive modalities we get to use. A common saying in our field is like, if all you have is a hammer, all you have is adjustments, everything's going to be a nail. You need more than just adjustments as a chiropractor in your toolkit to provide proper care, in my opinion. And with that being said, I think people and patients need to know that adjustments aren't the only thing chiropractors can do. They can do a lot more, whether it's passive modalities or active modalities. Active modalities would be more education as well as
Recommendations maybe for PT or like strength training.
Strength training, rehab, exercises, nervous system regulation tactics, things like that. But passive modalities have a place. And when people are in pain and you can do something to make somebody in less pain, there's so much value in that. But they have to know that you're not fixing them, because one, they're not broken. Two, it all goes back to that all or nothing thing. Like, We need a mixture of all of these things.
Yeah.
But our narrative around it really, really matters.
Unfortunately, the narrative is you're broken and thus you need me to crack your back 3 times a week.
Right.
That just doesn't work.
No.
And what you're telling me, Taylor, is that half the medicine is in the relationship with the patient and seeing them eye to eye and being like, hey, this might actually really help you. Let's do some belly breaths together. That's something you said upstairs.
Yeah.
Even just like other physical touch, active mode, or not, I don't know if this would be active or passive, but you were like working on my neck earlier
that'd be
with
passive.
just your
Yep.
hands.
Yeah.
And just kind of doing some like, I don't know if that was craniosacral. What were you doing?
That was craniosacral, but it's all in the passive modality bucket of just
A toolbox.
It's a toolbox.
Okay.
Exactly.
I love that. I think that was an excellent primer on what chiropractic care is and isn't. And I think that leads us into the meat of this episode, which is what you said earlier. You said a chiropractor, for the most part, can support, even through doing a little crack into the back, can support a person who is not what we call hypermobile. Yeah. But for a hypermobile person, which is a lot of you guys listening, because I know that my chronic illness girlies are out there wondering why their bodies are so much more sensitive than everyone else's. You maybe could be hypermobile. You specifically are hypermobile and you support people with hypermobility.
Yes.
What is it?
Yeah. So hypermobility is a very big word for your joints move past the amount they are supposed to. Mm-hmm. Put in simple terms, if you've ever been told you were double jointed, that's a hypermobile joint. And so let's get some definitions out of the way. There's 4 types of hypermobility. There's localized hypermobility, meaning it's just in one area. So just your shoulder is hypermobile. There's peripheral hypermobility, which is in your hands and in your feet. There is historical hypermobility, meaning you were hypermobile in your past. Maybe you were a gymnast and you were hypermobile while you were a gymnast, but now you no longer are. Or there is what we're the meat and potatoes of today is called generalized joint hypermobility. Generalized joint hypermobility means 5 or more of your joints move past the range of motion that they're supposed to. Now, hypermobility is different than flexibility, and a lot of people get this confused. It's also different than instability, and so I want to define those as well. Flexibility is your muscles' ability to lengthen. Instability is your ability to control your range of motion. That is very different than hypermobility, which is your ability to extend past a range of motion.
For your joints.
For your joints.
So do people often get hyperflexibility and hypermobility confused? Because I now have been diagnosed with hypermobility.
Yeah.
And when I was a kid, everyone was like, she's just hyper flexible. Oh yeah, look at that. She can like put her toes on her eyeballs. Like what? And I just thought it was, and maybe some of it is hyper flexibility in my muscles, but no one caught that my joints were so hypermobile.
Exactly, 100%. And it gets confused all of the time. And they usually go together, which is why it doesn't always matter so much that they get confused, because they usually go together, but not all of the time. I have a friend who's extremely flexible, and I was a cheerleader growing up, and it made her an amazing cheerleader, and she wasn't hypermobile. That's like the dream.
She was just blessed.
She was just blessed.
She
Literally
was just
blessed.
flexible.
Just naturally flexible, did not have any actual hypermobility in her joints. And that is very different than somebody like me, who I am naturally flexible as well, but I have hypermobility in my joints and I have to watch out for those. And we'll discuss why in a second, but there is a difference.
Okay. So your hyper flexible friend probably didn't stand like the Wicked Witch, like those of us.
Exactly.
Hypermobile hunchbacks.
Yes.
Okay. So why does being hypermobile matter? And what is the lived experience of someone in a hypermobile body? How does it affect your life?
So we're going to speak about generalized joint hypermobility right now. So generalized joint hypermobility is a keynote characteristic of something called a connective tissue disorder. A connective tissue disorder. So first, connective tissue lines literally everything in our body: our muscles, our nerves, our organs, our everything, and everything in the
gut,
human body. Our gut,
our blood vessels, the backs of our eyes,
the backs of our
it's
eyeballs in general.
Literally insane that I didn't realize connective tissue is everywhere.
Everywhere.
Does it even include like bone?
It doesn't like line the bone, but
It's in
affected.
there somewhere.
Yeah. Well,
Okay.
the ligaments and the tendons which connect the bones. So
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's like the lining of your body, the thing that connects your hip
Everything.
bone to your knee bone, whatever,
exactly.
is all connective tissue.
Yes,
Okay,
exactly,
great.
Exactly. So when you're hypermobile, that is a sign of a connective tissue disorder. There are a lot of connective tissue disorders. Marfan's is a common one. That one happens more in males than in females. I always pronounce this one wrong. Lloyd-Dietz syndrome is also a common one. There's a lot of connective tissue disorders. The one we're going to be talking about today is called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. There's 13 types of Ehlers-Danlos syndrome.
Wow.
We have a genetic marker for all 12 EDS types, except for what we're considering the hypermobile type. So HEDS is what we're talking about right now. HEDS, we do not have a genetic marker for right now. It stands for hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. It is a connective tissue disorder. We believe it is genetic in nature. And the Norris lab, which if anybody is interested in donating anywhere in this space, is hands down the best place to donate in this space. Courtney Jessimer is the leading researcher there, and they are very, very close to finding the gene for HEDS, which is super, super exciting.
So it doesn't mean that HEDS is not genetic. It just means we don't know it yet. So you have to be diagnosed by external criteria instead of a genetic lab test.
Exactly. It's a clinical diagnosis. So how diagnosis work, before we get there, I think we need to back up. So we have our generalized joint hypermobility. 5 or more joints in your body are hypermobile.
Body-wide hypermobility,
Yep.
which will be the people who are listening to this episode who are really affected by random chronic pain and weird stuff going on in their body.
Exactly.
Okay.
So now we have 2 categories, asymptomatic and symptomatic. And it's so important to know that if you are bendy, if you've been told you are double jointed, but you have no pain, you have no issues, you have no stomach issues, no gut issues, no nervous system issues, asymptomatic hypermobility exists. I don't want you to freak out just because you're quote unquote double jointed. That does not mean that you're going to get symptoms. 57% of the population, that obviously these numbers are like ebbing and flowing as we speak. But right now, the most recent paper that came out, 57% of the population has generalized joint hypermobility. 10% of those are what we consider symptomatic. So majority are asymptomatic. And
So I'm a rare gem.
Enjoy it. Yes, we're rare. We're all rare here. We're all rare here. So 10% of people with generalized joint hypermobility, and like I said, these numbers are going to change tomorrow. They're constantly changing, so don't hold on to me onto these numbers, have symptomatic generalized joint hypermobility. When we think of symptomatic generalized joint hypermobility, we're going to then break that into 2 other categories, acquired and genetic. Acquired means you got it from something like a sport. A lot of gymnasts, cheerleaders, ice skaters, swimmers can get hypermobility from their sport.
Just by overuse of joints?
Overuse of joints. There's also something called overstretching, which anybody watching this, please, if you're a gymnast or if you have a child that's a gymnast or a cheerleader or a dancer, do not let their coaches do overstretching. What overstretching means is they are putting weight in an extended range of motion. It is very bad for your joints and it is not necessary. You can get the same body positions with a lot of other tactics that are way, way, way safer.
Okay.
That was a side tangent. And in that acquired category is also something that we're going to call HSD, which stands for hypermobile spectrum disorder, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. There's also other things in the acquired category, like car accidents can give you acquired hypermobility. Trauma in general can give you acquired hypermobility.
Emotional?
Like physical
Okay,
trauma.
physical trauma.
Yeah.
Got it. So something happened to you, you never felt right since, and maybe something's extra bendy after that thing happened.
Exactly, which happens in a lot of car accidents.
Okay.
And then the other side is the genetic, which is what we were talking about before, which is the genetic connective tissue disorders like Marfan's, EDS, and Lloyd-Dietz syndrome.
Okay, that's not acquired. That's
genetic.
You were born with that.
Exactly.
And from what I know, Marfan's and Lloyd-Dietz, those are more obvious syndromes in a sense, where not only will there be a symptomatic picture, but you'll actually notice certain facial features. These people are more likely to get diagnosed pretty young because it shows up in their features. But with EDS and the different types of EDS, it's not always so obvious, right?
Absolutely. You nailed that. And the big reason for that is because schools teach EDS, and I can say this from chiropractic school, they teach it as you have to have the stretchiest skin in the world to have EDS. That's not that's 1 point on the diagnostic criteria. It's 1 point.
Even on TikTok, if you type in EDS, you will see more of like the extreme examples because that's more so what will get kind of like engagement even on the algorithm because people are like, whoa, their skin is stretching like crazy.
Right.
But what would someone with EDS or HEDS, where we haven't even found a genetic piece yet, experience that is not as obvious?
Oh, yeah, a lot of things. And most people with HEDS specifically don't know that they have it and have gone to thousands of doctors and been told, all your tests are normal, all your scans are normal, this is just anxiety, I don't know what to do with you, be gone.
So basically they could have a picture, which we'll talk about, of like comorbid, generalized body-wide symptoms, everything from chronic pain to anxiety, that will not be attributed to hypermobile joints because they're going to doctors who are not evaluating them for that. And they're just seeing a person with anxiety and saying, you must have anxiety. They're not looking deeper.
Exactly.
Before we move on to that and why symptomatic hypermobility can cause those body-wide symptoms, I do want to ask, when it comes to the non-symptomatic population, that 57% of people who are super bendy but are experiencing no downstream effects from it, is there a hallmark event that can push them from non-symptomatic to suddenly symptomatic?
Yeah, and we're seeing that a lot right now, especially with COVID. And the silver lining to COVID for me, and I know this is selfish, is that we're getting some really good research in this space that we did not have before.
She's cutthroat.
Yeah. And I selfishly love the amount of research that's coming out on this because 3 years ago, not that long ago, there was nothing. You would research this, you would find nothing. Now there's like a decent amount of stuff that we can use to help people, which is really cool. But to answer your question, yes. And we think a lot of that has to do with mast cells, which I'm sure we're going to get into in a little bit. But usually some sort of traumatic event will happen that can spike different things for whatever reason. I think it's the mast cells, but we can get into that in a second.
Can activate the body's inflammatory system or immune system because there's a threat. So what you're saying, so COVID, or what we're knowing as long COVID, is can be a trigger or a picture of a manifestation of hypermobility suddenly becoming symptomatic because now the body is all of a sudden becoming inflamed from the hyperextension of joints, whereas before the viral event, the body was not becoming inflamed from hyperextension?
So I think actually the viral infection and the mast cell component of it is actually creating more inflammation, and that is causing the symptoms. And now your hypermobility is seemingly becoming symptomatic because of that. And we're seeing that not only in long COVID, which is the most common one that we're seeing, that maybe used to be asymptomatic. You didn't even think about it, didn't even know about it. And now all of a sudden you are in pain. You can't get out of bed. You're so fatigued. You can't even function anymore.
Yeah.
We also see this a lot after pregnancy. And I don't think this is talked about enough. I see more postpartum symptomatic hypermobile cases than I ever imagined to. I did not realize that this was, in pregnancy is a traumatic event. Let's call it what it is. So it makes sense. But I would say the two most common that I see are postpartum as well as long COVID right now.
Before we had the research on long COVID, which I think validated long haul post-viral syndromes, which we've talked about in herbalism for so long, the amount of classes that we had on post-viral inflammatory, inflammatory activation and how to help people with mushrooms and other things that bring their inflammatory and immune response down. It was very well known in the alternative world, but I think now we're finally having science because COVID is so ubiquitous. Right. But did this used to happen with other viruses like mono or something? Because I never felt quite right after having mono.
So EBV, 100%. I would say 90% of my clients have had mono. I don't think there's any research on that. I don't think there ever will be any research on that, unfortunately. But 1,000%, I think that is a big piece as well.
And does it seem kind of like a crapshoot? Like someone who has mono or COVID is not going to have a symptomatic issue afterwards or a long haul viral, and some people are. Some bodies just perceive that as more traumatic than others.
So a recent paper just came out, and it's seemingly that generalized joint hypermobility is a predictor or a risk factor for getting long COVID. And they found 30% of people who did not recover from COVID in this paper were hypermobile, had generalized joint hypermobility. So it's seemingly that it is a risk factor. And the reason is because, like we said, connective tissue lines literally everything in our body. And what I'm about to say is a hypothesis based off of the evidence we currently have. And our mast cells live in our connective tissue. When we have a viral infection and mast cells then now are producing a lot of inflammatory factors, a lot of histamine, a lot of something called elastase. There's a lot of things that our mast cells produce that can lead to different types of symptoms. And in my opinion, that is what is happening. And again, that is a hypothesis. It is not 100% proven right now.
Okay. And mast cells are just immune cells, essentially, that become activated by a viral illness or another threat or a trauma, any kind of like nervous system or immune activation. And like you said, they send out all of these inflammatory chemicals that are meant to be helpful to our bodies in the short term, but continue kind of getting sent out when we're overactivated for too long. I don't want to get too into the weeds, but you just mentioned elastase, that our mast cells release elastase. And from what I know, elastase can actually break down your connective tissue / make your joints looser. So is it kind of perhaps that COVID and long COVID can actually make your hypermobility worse and make you more bendy?
In my opinion, yes.
Wow.
Again, this is my 100% just my opinion, but in my opinion, yes.
Okay. So if that was too in the weeds for some people, I want to just bring it, like zoom it out for a second and just say hypermobility exists.
Yes.
Very bendy, double jointed people. If it's body wide and 5 or more joints, you may have body wide generalized hypermobility.
Yes.
This may be a risk factor for you. It may be behind certain symptoms that you're experiencing, which we're going to talk about now. And it may be a risk factor for why you would respond more intensely to something like COVID, as well as have a slew of health issues be activated after COVID. So regardless, it is something good to be aware of, to know if you are hypermobile, so that you can be prepared that if you ever do have symptoms, you can look to your hypermobility first as a way to manage them.
Absolutely. And as practitioners and clinicians, it's really important that we know this so that we can change our treatment plan accordingly. Having hypermobility drastically changes every single healthcare's treatment plan, especially in the musculoskeletal space, like chiropractors, physical therapists, and occupational therapists.
Okay. So double jointedness is a sign that people might be hypermobile. What are some other things that they can just like look for in their body to know if they should get evaluated, and where would they get evaluated, just so that they can get that out of the way?
Yeah. So let's talk about the whole evaluation process. So if you feel like you have a lot of GI distress, you feel like you're a very anxious or highly sensitive person, you're in chronic pain, unexplained chronic pain. You've been to all the doctors and no one has seen anything or can tell you what's going on. Maybe you have a lot of fatigue. Any sort of widespread symptoms,
Chronic inflammation type
symptoms is a good indicator that you should just get looked at for this.
Especially if you're bendy.
Yes, especially if you're bendy. Now, a very common symptom in this population is something called subluxations, different than the subluxation theory, which is these subluxations exist. So this is what a medical subluxation, when your joint partially comes out of its socket and then comes right back in. This is because of the ligament laxity that can come along with a connective tissue disorder. And that is not the only thing that makes somebody hypermobile. And a lot of clinicians will say, oh, you don't sublux or you don't dislocate, you can't have HEDS. That's not true. And so HEDS and hypermobile spectrum disorder, which we need to define that one as well, is a spectrum, meaning every single person is going to have different symptoms. They're going to experience different things. It doesn't mean you don't have the condition because you don't have one thing on that list. And also, if you're feeling better one day versus another day, that's normal too.
And why would hypermobility, whether it's from HEDS or hypermobility spectrum disorder, cause those things, like cause comorbidities as severe as anxiety or chronic pain or joint pain or like nervous system conditions?
Yeah. So it all goes back to the connective tissue. So our connective tissue, which lines everything, when we have the proteins not coded correctly and the connective tissue is more fragile and easier to get messed up, it affects every single system in our body.
So let's take this back to chiropractic care for one moment. Why should someone who is hypermobile not just go and see any chiropractor? And why should they especially not ever get their neck adjusted.
Yeah, so this is really, really important. And we are taught in school that EDS is we shouldn't adjust people's necks with EDS, but that's like it. That's all they tell us. They don't tell us why. They don't really make a big deal about it. The real reason is it's really dangerous. And there's a lot of big, bad, and scary things that can happen when you get adjusted if you have a hypermobile neck. The biggest one is something called upper cervical instability, which is when your first vertebra or your second vertebra are unstable and they can move to a point where they hit really important structures like your brainstem. And if you get an adjustment and that now hits your brainstem, that's scary. That's really, really bad. And I can speak from personal experience. That is something that happened to me in chiropractic school, and it was traumatizing and very, very scary. And it happens to a lot more people than a lot of chiropractors realize.
It does. My acupuncturist told me that when she got her neck adjusted once, she completely blacked out and went blind. She actually couldn't see for several hours and was at the ER, and her vision came back, everything was normalized. But the guy at the ER was like, you have no idea how many people come in here every single day. He's like, I would never get my neck adjusted, period. I don't care who you are. And now it makes sense that knowing so many of us in the population actually are hypermobile, even if we don't have full-blown EDS or another one of these genetic conditions, there's a spectrum of hypermobility that a lot of us fall under, and more of us are finding out we're hypermobile. It's just good practice to not get your neck adjusted.
Yep, 100%. And there's other big, bad, and scaries too, like CSF leaks are really common in this population because our CSF fluid and our connective tissue and everything is just more fragile. And also, do we need an adjustment? We talked about someone who would need it is someone who needs a short-term increase in range of motion. When you're hypermobile, especially in your neck, you probably don't need that short-term increase in range of motion. And the reality is you can get relief from so many other things. Going back to the toolbox, you need more tools in your toolkit.
When someone who is hypermobile is having pain, especially something like neck pain, which is really common, and I do want to ask you why, but when they're having pain, what do they need instead of an adjustment? Is it usually a release of tension and more kind of like massage?
So it depends on what they're dealing with. There's a lot of different, what we call comorbidities that come along with a connective tissue disorder. A big one is something called dysautonomia, which has a lot to do with blood flow. And when we don't get enough blood flow to our brain, that in itself can lead to neck pain, something called coat hanger syndrome, if you've ever heard of that.
I have.
Exactly. So that would respond better to dysautonomia and nervous system regulation tactics. Whereas somebody who's experiencing, let's say, a cervicogenic headache, which is also really common in this population, that one's tension headache.
Okay.
Cervicogenic is when you feel it in your right on your skull. That responds relatively well to like the massage work I was doing upstairs.
Wow. Okay. What is dysautonomia? Is it the same thing as POTS? I think a lot of people know it as POTS, but I know it's not exactly a one-for-one. And why does that often come alongside hypermobility as well as histamine issues like MCAS?
Yeah, absolutely. So dysautonomia is a big umbrella term, meaning first, your autonomic nervous system is the part of your body that controls the things you don't think about. Your breathing, your digestion, your swallowing, all the stuff you don't have to think about, your heart rate. That's what your autonomic nervous system controls. When you have dysautonomia, you have a messed up autonomic nervous system. You can be oversympathetic, you can be over parasympathetic, you can be under sympathetic, you could be under parasympathetic. There's a lot of different types of dysautonomia. POTS is one type of dysautonomia. It is the most common, which is why it's talked about the most, but there's actually like 30 different types of dysautonomia. POTS is just one of those types. Another really common one is called orthostatic hypotension. Those are the two most common.
What's the difference between POTS and orthostatic hypotension?
So POTS stands for postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, and it affects your heart rate. And so what POTS is your autonomic nervous system out of whack, and you're going to have an increase in heart rate, specifically 30 beats per minute when you go from laying down to standing. Whereas orthostatic hypotension deals with your blood pressure, and that one is when your blood pressure drops 20 beats or mmHg going from laying down to standing.
That's why I see the stars when I get up.
Yeah.
All the damn time.
Yep.
Oh my God, it's so scary.
Yep.
Why the heck would dysautonomia be associated with hypermobility?
So there's a lot of things associated with hypermobility. And I want to just preface this that we don't always know why. We just know that it is.
Okay.
There's a lot in this. You'll hear ADHD. You'll hear neurodivergent. You'll hear MCAS. You'll hear dysautonomia. There's a lot associated, a lot of comorbidities associated with HEDS. We don't really know why. We have hypotheses, and a lot of the hypotheses go back to the mast cells and connective tissue disorder. And it all is because of the connective tissue lining everything, but we don't really know specifically why. And so like we said before, connective tissue lines everything, including our blood vessels. And that's a big, big piece of dysautonomia, especially POTS and especially orthostatic hypotension. And if you've ever heard of blood pooling, that's what a common symptom is.
So this is why the blood flow specifically is affected, either blood pressure dropping or blood flow coming too fast with the tachycardia?
Either too fast or too slow. Like I said, there's a bunch of different things, but your blood vessels in general are lined by connective tissue, and you can have too bendy blood vessels, believe it or not. And if that happens, you're more prone to something called blood pooling, which is, in this population, they like to say they're allergic to gravity. And so when they stand up, that face, when they stand up, their blood pools at their feet and doesn't get to their heart or their brain. And that can lead to a whole slur of symptoms, which is why we should all be wearing compression socks.
This is why I haven't been able to wear heels greater than like 1.5 inches in 10 years, because my blood pools so fast, especially when I'm like compressing my foot incorrectly and cutting off blood flow with a heel.
Same. I went to a wedding. This was like last year. It was a family wedding. And my grandma kept looking at my feet and she's like, Taylor, why is your feet so red? And I was so embarrassed, but like,
this happens to me even when I stand in the shower for too long, especially
showers
because of
a trigger
hot water.
for a lot of people. Yep.
Why would people with hypermobility and issues with their connective tissue and their blood vessels and abnormal blood flow because of this whole picture have trouble with showers?
So big component of showers, there's a couple things going on. One, we're standing for a longer period of time than people realize. Two, proprioception, which is our body's awareness of where we are in space, is affected in hypermobility. We have less ability to tell our brain where our body is in space. When we're in a shower, a lot of the times we are standing in a hyperextended position without realizing. There's also temperature dysregulation stuff that happens with dysautonomia. That's a big, big part of showers. You're going from room temperature to now something that's really hot back to room temperature. That's going to affect your symptoms. And then the blood vessels in general and vasodilation is affected in these disorders, especially when you are in an upright position. Like we said, you're allergic to gravity. All that blood is pooling down to your feet. And with the other things going around, like we just talked about, showers can be really difficult for this population.
So should we all just like cold plunge, like biohack ourselves?
I wish that was the cure. I wish that would save everybody.
I'm like saying it's the opposite of the cure, and I'm so annoyed at every man in a cold plunge who's like making a reel, like just do this,
and all your problems will go away.
I'm like, my blood vessels like don't contract properly, so I'd probably die. But yeah, essentially, I like that you're painting this picture of what someone who has hypermobility and the resulting connective tissue, blood vessel issues, possible POTS, possible histamine issues might experience in their day-to-day. Yeah. So to kind of like give people a little break from the technical terms and just kind of give them this umbrella of here's what your life might be like. Here's what your challenges might be if you're someone who experiences this. Can we kind of summarize them? Troubles with showers, where you're having like blood pooling or like weird red splotches, or like you're getting really tired in the shower. Standing for too long might give you a lot of discomfort / you're getting like blood pooling, redness, swelling. What else might they experience on this very high level? Fatigue is the number one most common symptom in this population. Some level of dizziness. And when I say dizziness, not like the vertigo dizziness where the room is spinning, but more of that lightheadedness. You're seeing stars, especially going from sitting to standing. Widespread joint pain in general. Feeling like you're always running into things, or you were told you were super clumsy as a kid, is a big, big one. Always running into things and tripping over your ankles a lot. Not being able to walk in a straight line is a big one. Having to hold a pencil tighter than your peers. Dude, I gotta hold it with like 3 fingers like this. Yeah. And getting hand pain when you're writing is a big one too. I lost my train of GI issues is huge in this population. And usually it's like wavering GI issues. So like diarrhea and constipation that
comes back and forth and their diagnosis is IBS. And
They're like, oh, you just have IBS C and D.
Yeah.
And I'm like,
Yeah.
can we pick one? I'm not sure this is like really fitting into this term. Okay, so gut issues.
Yep.
Headaches, are those common?
Headaches is huge.
And then you said like the coat hanger pain, which if people aren't familiar with that, it's literally pain at the back of your neck in the shape of a coat hanger that radiates down into the shoulders and like the upper back, right?
Exactly.
And does your head and like neck just feel tired throughout the day, just holding your head up like a normal person?
Yeah, so that would be for upper cervical instability. A big symptom of upper cervical instability is that you can't hold your head up and your head feels too heavy for your body. And maybe you are always sitting like this. You have to hold your head up physically because your neck is unstable and it's not allowing that to happen. And some symptoms with that also are very similar to dysautonomia symptoms. It's dizziness, it's headaches, it's vision changes, cognitive impairment, fatigue. And this specifically, it's a different type of neck pain than the dysautonomia neck pain.
And the mental health stuff that you mentioned, like anxiety, even depression, and like things that are coming in and out, anxiety that's coming in and out, depression, black clouds that are coming in and out. This could be the picture of the inflammatory response that happens when your body is reacting to hypermobility that changes day to day.
Yeah. And the thing with anxiety too that I get really upset about is practitioners will say, they'll look at your thing and they'll say, oh, you have anxiety. So all of these can just be chopped up to anxiety. You can have anxiety and dysautonomia and MCAS and HEDS. They're not mutually exclusive. And most people do have both.
Yeah.
We can still address the anxiety and the dysautonomia and the MCAS. Why can't we all work together? Why does it have to be so black and white? Why does it have to be so all or nothing?
So you're just painting a picture of someone who just walks through the world with a lot more pain and sensitivity than other people.
Yeah.
This is like the person who can't stay out as late as their friends. And when they're at a club, the lights are like killing them. And you're like, why do people think that these flashing green lights in my cornea are fun?
Yeah.
Like, this is not fun.
I'm not having a good time right now.
I'm going to faint.
Yeah.
Or this is like, people that like can't stand on their feet for a long time, even if they're young and fit. And we're just having like this weird foot swelling and pain. And we're like, sorry, like I didn't know I was 95. It's people who are having a lot more mental health and GI issues who are just like the IBS girlies. There's so much you see online about like hot girls have IBS, but it's not normal to have this stomach pain all the time and to have to like watch everything you eat and have a perfect diet that doesn't upset your GI system. So you're just describing a highly sensitive person with a highly sensitive body. And we don't realize that all of those things could be due to us being extra bendy and hypermobile and having a different experience in our bodies.
Yeah, exactly. You nailed it.
So does managing / living your life in a way that caters to your hypermobility then help with all of these things?
Yeah. And that's the biggest, most important thing, that if you're going to take anything away, you can get better. You can learn treatment strategies and management strategies to increase your quality of life. Now, there is no cure for a genetic connective tissue disorder.
Cool.
That doesn't mean, there's no cure, but that doesn't mean that there's no hope. That doesn't mean that you can't live a life that you enjoy and that you love. You just need the right people on your team. And my biggest pet peeve, and this happens way too often, is practitioners and doctors saying there's no point in getting an HEDS diagnosis because there's nothing you can do for it anyways. That's just a lie. I see it every single day, people improving their quality of life, exercising again, getting back to the things that they love, working again, just by implementing very simple lifestyle management strategies. This stuff isn't even crazy or expensive. It's stuff that you can just work on. And I'm not saying it's easy, but it's the simple things.
Mm-hmm. So wait, you just mentioned like people can exercise again. Could hypermobility be a reason why someone is the type of person who's like, I hate exercise, and when I do what Jen over there does, I'm like laid out for 4 days afterwards, even though I barely moved. And like, then it creates all this shame of like, my body's just not athletic and I'm so out of shape.
And I'm lazy. Yes, 100%. That's what I do. That's what people come to me for is I've tried exercise. I used to love exercise. I used to be an athlete. And now when I do it, I do a simple workout. I go to a yoga class. I go to a whatever class, and I'm out. I'm bedbound for days afterwards. I can't move. I'm so tired, or I'm in so much pain because of exercise now. And it's a big, big, big problem in this population.
Why is that happening to people? Why are they having such a strong negative response to exercise when they're hypermobile?
A lot of different reasons. So the biggest one deals with proprioception in general. When we are working out and we don't know where our body is in space, we may be hyperextending under load, meaning under volume, and that can cause some issues, as you can imagine, as well as we like to use our hypermobility to our advantage when we don't know that we have it. And that a lot of the time can lead to compensations. It can also lead to you not actually getting what you need out of that exercise. That in itself can cause some issues, but we also speed through exercises a lot because of that.
I know people are listening right now like, yes, that's me. Yes, that's me. Oh my God. Like, I can't even explain to you how much learning that I was hypermobile made my entire experience in my physical body and my entire athletic history make sense. It was to the point where Nick used to be like, why do you run like that? He would always make fun of how I ran because I'm like throwing and flailing my body in this funky, like, neurodivergent, hypermobile way to get myself to run fast enough. And it was like working, but like you said, I was using my hypermobility to my advantage to propel my body forward because I didn't know how to like use the right muscles, well, not right muscles, but the major muscle groups that I should have been relying on, which we'll chat about. And even with form, Nick would try to teach me how to exercise and I'd be doing like a simple row and he's like, yeah, you're supposed to feel it in your back. And I'm like, it's just my entire trap and neck that I'm feeling. I'm not feeling anything in the back. And he's like, why can't you feel it here? Why can't you do the form right? And I'm like, I just don't understand where that body part is on my body and how to activate it.
And that's proprioception.
And I had the hardest time exercising. And he was like, well, you're just not getting the form. But it's just our brains work differently. We don't have the mind muscle signals.
Exactly.
And like we were even talking upstairs about bowling, right?
Yeah.
It was funny to have Michelle, who we have a whole episode about histamine where we mention hypermobility, but Michelle is the person who saw that I was hypermobile. She saw that I was resting my neck against a wall to make it through a conversation and was like, does your neck hurt all the time? And I was bowling with her and I will twist and contort my body and like put my leg up to the sky to get the bowling ball to go where I want it to go. And I'll get the strike.
You'll get it. Yeah.
Because I've learned how to leverage the weird ways in which my body bends to get my body to do things.
Yeah.
So if you have always felt like, oh my God, I move my body in weird ways and I've just learned to do it that way, this is why.
Yeah, exactly. In that experience, what you just defined, you're not alone in that. There's so many people who are coming to those realizations and feeling the same way that you did. And I'm right there with you. I remember in college, I had some random stranger come up to me and was like, why do you walk like that?
Dude, the amount of times someone's asked me why I walk like that. I'm like, I don't know how I walk.
Yeah, like, and also like, maybe don't go up to strangers and say weird things like that. Just like
I can't.
A good note. But in general, yeah, there's a lot of different reasons. And I think one thing too, especially in workout classes, and I'm not saying workout classes are bad. I'm a big proponent. Once you get to the point where you know your body, I love them. But a lot of people will go to workout classes and they want to look like the instructor or they want to look like the people around them so they contort their bodies into ways to make it that way, even if they aren't feeling the best doing that, and then wonder why they aren't feeling so great afterwards. And a lot of the times it's because those workout classes may not be designed for a hypermobile body, and that's okay. There's ways we can modify it. They're never off limits, but you may need to be okay and give yourself permission to not look like that instructor. It's okay to not do everything the same as everybody else.
Oh, so you mean like a yoga class is not a competition to where I'm like, I can stretch farther than everyone else in this room.
Exactly what I mean.
The way I used to literally contort.
Same.
And I think that's another thing. These are like all these little, you're hypermobile when like you see your yoga, that that's your strength, that you can move your joints at a greater angle than anybody else around you to your own detriment.
And easily.
And you'll be like, oh, look how advanced I am. I'm just holding this pose, like whatever. And it's actually hurting you. And then you're going to be in pain or in like a quote flare, which I also want to ask you about, for 5 days after. And you're like, just because your body can do that doesn't mean it should.
Absolutely.
That's like the golden mantra for hypermobile folks and something I had to learn. But it's funny that there's just all of these little things that when you look back, you're like, oh, that makes sense. That's because I was hypermobile. Oh, the reason I'm like hunching all the time and people say I have terrible posture, it's because I just haven't strengthened the muscles that would make good posture easy for me because I've relied on being crunchy and hypermobile. So all of these little things looking back give an explanation.
Yeah, 100%.
Okay, so I want to talk about what you said is that you can take strategies, you can make lifestyle changes, you can do certain exercises, you can have a healthier, happier, more pain-free life with hypermobility. I want to talk about what that looks like. But first, I just want to ask you how hypermobility relates to flares. That was something that you brought up on your question sheet. Flares of what? What do they look and feel like? And how would we manage a flare?
Yeah, absolutely. So flares basically means any of your symptoms are heightened. It's really not more complicated than that. For this population, what that usually looks like is their dysautonomia is flaring, their MCAS is flaring, or their joint pain is flaring. And it's really important to be able to categorize what is what. And that's something I work on with clients a lot is this a dysautonomia flare? Great, we have dysautonomia management strategies. Let's use those. Is this a hypermobility flare? Is your joints flaring up because maybe we have more elastase because we're on our period or for whatever reason? And so how we go about flares, how I work with clients is we do something called flare tracking. And there's actually an amazing app made by two amazing women who have EDS called the Guava app. It's a flare tracking app. It's amazing and they're the best. But I actually do flare tracking with all of my clients to empower them to see trends and figure out triggers in their control, triggers out of their control, and create what I call a flare routine so that they feel like they know what to do for short-term relief instead of depending on their chiropractor or their massage therapist or whatever, so that they have the confidence, okay, yeah, this sucks. I'm going to be in a flare today, but I have strategies to make it less intense. And our biggest goal with flares, because living with a connective tissue disorder, a big part of it is accepting that you are going to have symptoms every now and then.
I'm not there at the acceptance yet. I just think I need to wake up earlier and work out harder.
It don't work like that. It just don't work like that. I wish it did. But it doesn't have to be this death sentence. You can accept that, okay, I'm a little bit different. I have to work a little bit harder. I have to do things a little bit differently than my peers, but I can still have a great quality of life. And I'm not downplaying other people's symptoms because this disorder can be extremely, extremely severe. Yeah. I've been there. I've been in the trenches before.
Some people are like in bed for months and months at a time and can't move when they're in a flare and don't understand why. And they're just told, oh, it's fibromyalgia.
Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm. Exactly. And on that note, it's also important to know HEDS, I'm not speaking about VEDS or any of the other types of EDS, is not a progressive disorder. And what that means, a progressive disorder is a disorder that naturally over time gets worse by the nature of the disorder itself. I get a lot of pushback when I say this on social media and online. That doesn't mean that HEDS can't be severe. HEDS can be extremely severe. It's a spectrum. There are people on this end of the spectrum that are in debilitating amounts of pain and debilitating amounts of fatigue. That doesn't change the fact that HEDS is not a progressive disorder. That's really good news. That means that, okay, by the nature of this disorder, I'm not going to just get worse. But what we see happen, and I labeled this the domino effect, is we have a subluxation. Now we can't work out. Now because we can't work out, our dysautonomia is getting worse because we're becoming deconditioned. Now because our dysautonomia is getting worse. And it's just this feedback loop that goes over and over again. But it's really good news that it's not a progressive disorder, and that shouldn't be seen as a negative thing.
Okay, I want to walk it back to when you said a flare is when your hypermobility, like pain or your POTS or like maybe your histamine symptoms are all getting worse in like this cyclical nature or like prompted by something in your life. For the average person who doesn't yet understand what those things are and what their symptoms look like in each of those buckets, a flare for someone with hypermobility who's listening and being like, oh my God, that's my body, could be when your anxiety and your diarrhea and your neck pain all get worse at the same time on the same day. And you're like, what the heck is happening? All of a sudden I feel like I'm dying.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yep.
let's talk about like the management techniques and like the daily lifestyle things that prevent flares from happening and the things that everyone listening to this, recognizing their body in this picture, should be doing.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, we can't prevent flares from happening, but what we can do is decrease their intensity and their frequency. I know we haven't accepted yet, so it's okay. But we can decrease their intensity and frequency so they can come on less frequently. They can last shorter. And they can be, how I like to describe it, my goal for all of my clients is I don't want you to ever be in a debilitating flare. I want flares to be an annoyance. I want you to be annoyed by your flares because that's valid and flares are annoying. They suck, but they should never debilitate you. That is my goal for all of my clients and for everybody in this population. The way we can go about that is by tracking and figuring out what triggers are in our control, what triggers are out of our control, and then what do we do about both of those situations. I like to break this up into what I call warning signs. Warning signs we're going to be proactive with, and then triggers we're going to be reactive with. And so I'm going to give an example. A warning sign would be blood pooling. You look down at your feet and you see that they're super, super red. You can be proactive in that case. Put your compression socks on, lie on your back, put your legs up the wall for 5 to 10 minutes, do some nervous system regulation strategies, do something to get blood back to your brain. That can potentially make the flare less intense and last shorter because now we got blood back to our head and we got blood flow going and maybe we're not experiencing the coat hanger pain because of that, et cetera, et cetera.
What could be the consequence of not acting at the point of, oh, I'm seeing that my blood is pooling?
And you just go about your normal day. You're probably going to feel really, really dizzy. You're probably going to be very, very fatigued. You're probably going to have a headache. You're probably going to have coat hanger pain. Shortness of breath is a big one. Heart palpitations, all of that.
I'm picking up what you're putting down. Okay. And so that is a situation where you're going to be proactive when you're noticing something happening. Is there something else besides the blood pooling that we should be looking out for?
There's so many warning signs.
Okay.
Like
maybe name like 3 common other ones.
Vocal cord dysfunction is a big one. Big
so
one.
Your voice gets a little hoarse?
Yeah. Yeah. It's a big one. Connective tissue. And also a lot of vagus nerve stuff is involved in this as well.
Okay. So if you notice your voice is getting hoarse, what's the proactive strategy we're going to take there?
That one's usually going to be more MCAS focused and MCAS based. So this is not medical advice. Talk to your practitioners, but potentially upping your antihistamines or going on a low histamine diet during that time period.
Drinking some nettle leaf tea.
Yep.
All right.
Exactly.
Love that.
Exactly. All of that. Again, not medical advice. And then a third one would be swelling in an area. That's a good warning sign for different types of, potentially you might have had a subluxation and not realized it if an area is swollen. And so we may want to, depending on the area, do some different muscle engagement tactics to hopefully prevent spasms in that area, because that's usually what happens after a subluxation.
Okay.
So those are just some examples.
And then what are things that we are going to look out for where we have to be reactive instead of proactive?
So these are going to be what we are going to label as triggers. Triggers are something we do, not something our body shows us. That's warning signs. Something that we do that we know brings on symptoms. And so a really good example of this is having not good sleep, or having less than 7 hours of sleep is one of the most common ones that I see. Another one that's not in our control would be your period. Being on your period and having an estrogen spike is going to, histamine follows estrogen. And so that is a big trigger for a lot of people, but it's not to the point where you can generalize it and say, okay, every single person who is on their period is going to feel this. You have to know for your individual self, which is why tracking is so important. And I really hate when people generalize and are like, you should do this for your luteal phase and this for your whatever phase. Like, that's not how humans work. We're all an individual. But yeah.
So someone could have a pattern of flares when their estrogen is rising, whereas another person could have a pattern of flares when their estrogen is falling.
Exactly.
Which means one person might feel like crap at the beginning of their cycle, another person might feel like crap at the end of their cycle. But until you track your cycle and make notes about what you're feeling each day and have maybe like 3 or 4 cycles of notes to find patterns, you won't really know where your flares happen.
Exactly. You nailed it. And the cool thing about the Guava app is it has a correlation button that will do that for you. So it will take all of your data. You need a month's worth of data, but it will take all of your data and tell you, like, on your 4th day of your period, you felt these symptoms. There's a correlation there. It's really cool.
So you also mentioned that a like reactive thing that could cause a direct kind of like issue, flare, moment of pain and anxiety and all of these symptoms increasing is not just a subluxation, but like something you mentioned earlier where you're overextending a joint during exercise under load. And this is something I really want to highlight to people because I was doing in the gym, I was doing glute kickbacks, okay? Which is that lovely little exercise where you got, kind of a weighted string attached to your foot and you're pumping that foot backwards, kind of like doing a backwards donkey kick. Yep. That is the best language I have to describe that. And you're doing it under weight. Yep. And obviously, in order to lift that back foot up behind you, you're extending your lower back, right? Like that's kind of where you're hinging from.
Yep.
Because my lower back and my spine, as we know, are hypermobile, I was under load, under weight, lifting my little donkey kick up way too high and totally hyperextending my lower back every time I did that move. And I didn't understand why I was getting an immediate eye twitch, which for me is a sign that I am unwell and I'm in a flare and all of my other symptoms are about to get way worse.
Yeah.
Every time I would do that exercise, I would get an eye twitch, or every time I would back squat where I was like also probably hyperextending and hyperarching my lower back, I was getting this eye twitch and feeling like crap for the next week after that exercise. So it's so important to know that the way that you exercise and pushing yourself too hard, especially with weight training, even though weight training is good for this condition, can be a huge trigger. So would you say that the most important thing for this condition is weight training with a professional who can teach you the most safe form for hypermobility?
Yeah. And the reason that strength training is so important for this population, there's actually some very specific reasons for this. What we know is that when you have ligament laxity, your ligaments are like an overstretched rubber band. They don't come back. And so your body is really smart and it tries to help you out. And it adapts by saying, okay, muscles, you're going to get really, really tight now to provide that stability that my ligaments can't. And your muscles are like, great, I can do that. But they can only do that for so long. And if they're not strong enough or they're not able to handle the capacity needed to give your body that stability, they can become very, very fatigued. They can spasm, they can cramp, or they can just become really, really tight and feeling painful. And that's the most common thing we see. And so when we strength train in this population, it's important that we are also figuring out what areas need to have that level of capacity, because it's going to be different for every person. There's some similarities we can make, but if you know that your shoulder is one of the areas that is very loose on you and is constantly subluxing, we're probably going to want to do a lot of rhomboid and lat strengthening so that we can have those muscles instead of your pecs always being super, super tight. That's just one example. With that being said, though, form is not the only important thing when it comes to exercise. There's four main ways that we can there's more than four, but I like to say there's four main ways that we can adjust or modify any exercise to make it easier or harder. The first is volume, how much weight you're lifting, and load management in general. So why are you lifting that amount of weight? And are you just trying to increase every single time you go to the gym? Is that the right tactic for you? The second is tempo, how fast or how slow we're doing a movement. This one I think is very underlooked in this population. Yes. I'm sure when you were doing those glute kickbacks, we were doing them really, really fast because that's just what's easy for us. And it's easy to get our leg above our head.
To go bendy fast.
Exactly. The third is intensity, how much energy we're putting out. And the fourth is form, is how we're actually doing the exercise. And so it's more than just form, but yes, form is a piece of the puzzle.
So someone who in this population who's strength training should focus on tempo, going slow, as well as maybe doing more reps of an exercise versus going up in weight.
I would actually say the opposite. So I would say lower rep, higher weight so that we can get those muscles stronger, but doing it in a safe way where we are loading at a specific time period and we're not overloading the system. But the most common thing I see in this population from a practitioner standpoint is underloading this population. We do not need to be just doing resistance bands for the rest of our life. We can lift weights. We can lift heavy. We just have to, one, do it slow, and two, do it under the right circumstances and environment. But I am a huge believer that this population can lift heavy and should be when the time is right.
Can you talk to us about what's happening in this population where we are relying on our joints / ability to bend in funny ways in order to get weight off the ground versus relying on major stabilizing muscle groups that we are actually trying to work. And what I mean by that is, for example, with my body, I went to go get evaluated by a hypermobility informed PT, physical therapist. And she was like, wow, so every single exercise you do, you're just muscling through with your shoulders and your traps and your neck, basically. Like even when I was deadlifting, I was somehow lifting the weight for the deadlift with my neck, you know?
Yep.
She was like, you're just shouldering through it all. So you could be a person who, even if you are able to deadlift 120 pounds, and that is something your body can pick off the floor and can even look good doing it, it may actually be that you're just relying on the fact that your body can kind of crink in weird ways instead of engaging those muscles.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a really good example too of like, just because something looks like it's good or right, it's not only about the way an exercise looks. Your practitioners and your clinicians should be asking you, where are you feeling this? Also, you should be tracking how did you feel after you exercised in comparison to how did you feel before you were exercising? Because that can give us clues as well. But back to your original question, there's a couple reasons for this. One, there's a lot of anatomy changes when you're hypermobile. One of the most common is actually having longer arms, believe it or not, or longer extremities. And so deadlifting, so deadlifting is a perfect example of this. So let's just stick to deadlifting in general. So you're probably are lifting with your traps because your arms are so much longer. And so there's also different things that we can utilize, like RDLs is a great example, elevating them so that we can actually get through our full range of motion before our hands touch the ground because our arms are so long. The second most common reason for what you just described is proprioception. And so what proprioception is where our body is in space, and our muscles and our tendons have little receptors that tell our brain, she just moved her arm up. When you're hypermobile, for whatever reason, we don't really know why, probably goes back to all the connective tissue stuff, but that signal is slower in the hypermobile population. It's also less, so it doesn't happen as often as it should. And because of that, we struggle with knowing where our body is in space. And so when it comes to exercise, unless we have like a visual cue and are watching ourselves or videoing ourselves or a mirror, we think we are doing it the way that the person in front of us is, but we're not, because we just don't have that cueing system the same way. And it's just happening slower. And so it's a big piece of a lot of this population utilizing their hypermobility instead of actually using their muscles.
Wow. Okay, so an example of what my PT did to combat this, she was explaining that when I'm deadlifting, I'm not understanding where my body is in space. So I'm not really understanding like that my foot is grounded to the floor and that this muscle is here and must be activated when I lift this. So to give my body more input of where I am in space, as well as more like pressure and engagement of muscles to kind of wake them up while I'm doing the exercise, she had me do a single leg deadlift with my opposite leg against the wall behind me so that I could press into the wall, be like, oh, my glutes exist, that this is a body with glutes. And then when I was lifting up a weight on the ground, I already had the mind muscle awareness of my glutes and could make sure I was feeling them while I was picking up the weight. And that helped a lot. And that, I hope, just gives people an example of like what proprioception can feel like and why it's necessary.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of my favorite exercises. And utilizing external cues like having your foot on a wall or even putting a wall behind you for, let's say, shoulder press or something like that can be really, really helpful.
Why would putting like leaning up against the wall when you're shoulder pressing? Why would that help someone?
If you have hypermobility in your shoulders, you may be shoulder pressing out here.
Oh my God, Nick was always like, why are you going backwards? I'm like, bro, I'm going straight up and down. You don't feel that? He's like, no.
It doesn't look that way. And yeah, so putting an external cue behind you, or I'm a big proponent, video yourself. I know it probably feels weird.
It was the best thing I ever did.
It's the best thing. And I know it's scary and I know it feels uncomfortable. I promise nobody's thinking
You'll
of
make
you
great
more than
Instagram
yourself.
reels.
Yeah, exactly.
Are you kidding?
Exactly. And even if you're not one of those girlies who wants to make content, that's fine. Do it for yourself.
Yeah.
It's so empowering to say, okay, I saw this. I was a little bit farther back. I'm going to change that the next time. And then you actually did it. Like, that's such a cool feeling that you were able to do that for yourself.
Wow. Oh my God. These are just like such good tips for the gym girlies. And you had said earlier that your dysautonomia and different like manifestations of the inflammation / blood vessel BS from hypermobility can get worse when you're deconditioned.
Yeah.
Why? Why do we need to be conditioning? Why do we need to be strength training with hypermobility?
Yeah, so I want to preface this that there are certain conditions this does not apply to. The biggest one is something called ME/CFS. That is a common comorbidity in this population as well. They actually cannot do graded exercise therapy, and everything I'm about to say does not apply to this population. Or anybody that experiences something called post-exertional malaise. This does not apply to that population. For the rest of the population, especially POTS specifically, deconditioning can make your symptoms worse, but deconditioning is not the cause of your symptoms. And that is really important to know because a lot of people get diagnosed with POTS and are told, oh, you should have been working out. It's all your fault. That's not true. There is so much evidence showing that really active people get POTS as well. Deconditioning does not cause POTS, period, point blank. But it can make POTS worse. And the reason for that is our heart is a muscle. And when we have POTS, our heart rate is affected. If we're not training our heart, like anything else, move it or lose it, same thing, same idea. That also blood flow is a big component of this. And we do get
your heart
more
needs
blood
to
flow.
pump your blood.
Exactly.
So in order for that blood to also not pool as much, you want to have your heart strong. That is actually such an important call out because even with strength training, I'll do strength training hard enough that my heart gets involved sometimes, but I still notice that I do feel a lot better when I'm doing some form of cardiovascular exercise, even if that looks like fast walking or like fast incline walking. When I'm able to run or when I was able to run, that also felt really good. I think that was really strengthening my heart. And I always had less swollen ankles, less swollen feet, just less like dizziness, less symptoms in general when I was training my heart with something like running. But obviously that can push it too far for a lot of hypermobile people, especially if you have the form in which I have when I'm running. But strength training my legs helped me with my running form because I was able to actually just like use my legs to run instead of throwing my body to run.
Absolutely.
So it like all goes together. But yes, cardiovascular training, training your heart muscle, making sure that you have endurance of some kind and can like do hard things and kind of walk up a hill is important because you're training that muscle that's going to get your blood back up and is going to stop all the blood pooling and the fatigue and the craziness.
Absolutely. And if it feels hard right now and you were just diagnosed with POTS, that's because it is. It's really hard to do those basic things.
Yes.
And finding a provider who can create a workout program for you, for your body in a way that doesn't flare you for days afterwards and can get you reconditioned again can be a big, big game changer.
I feel like another reason why exercising and conditioning our muscles is so important when we have hypermobility is, again, going back to what you said earlier, that we get really used to not relying on our muscles and relying on throwing our body in interesting ways. And so I want to kind of talk a little bit about that, why it's important to start engaging major stabilizer muscles, what those are, and what are the key like workouts or like muscle groups that we need to focus on strengthening that can start to stabilize us.
Yeah. So this is for everybody, general population as well. We can't change our structure unless we have a scalpel. We don't have it. And goes back to the beginning question. Can we move bones with our hands? No, we can't. We cannot change our bony structure to a point where it clinically matters without a scalpel. But what we can do is train our muscles and our nervous system. And that's really powerful. And our body is adaptable and our body wants us to survive. That's all our body's job is to figure out how do we get her to survive. And so by training and having really strong muscles, especially if you're hypermobile, that's going to allow you to function easier, live your life easier, do things easier. Now, back to the hypermobility part of this is that when we have anatomical differences or variations, when we also have ligament laxity and our structure has not the greatest starting point, our muscles have to work harder than the general population. And we also know that it is, one, takes longer for us to build strength in the hypermobile population, and two, is harder for us, meaning that it's going to take more effort than the general population. And utilizing those stabilizing muscles. So some big game changers for this population is our rhomboids and our lats are really, really important to be nice and
Rhomboids
strong.
are like kind of at the top of the...
Yep. So our rhomboids are over here and our
like
lats
our wings?
our Serratus anterior is also a big one too. I don't
That's
think
the
we've talked
wing.
about. That's our wings. Our lats are the biggest muscle
I'm
in our
bro.
back.
I'm a bro. I only know the bro terms from Nick.
Okay, perfect.
He's like your traps, your wings, your delts.
Yeah, exactly. So your lats are your biggest muscle in your back.
Okay.
And they're pretty big. Also, our traps are really big. I don't think people
My
realize
traps are
how
huge,
yeah,
personally.
Yeah, exactly. And then our rhomboids are on top of those.
So they don't seem like they're a commonly trained muscle. Like
They're
we're usually
not.
hitting our lats and our wings and yeah.
I mean, so the other thing here is like we're not that specific with exercise. Like when you're doing a lat pull down, you're not just using your lats.
You are using your rhomboids.
Yeah,
so you kind of want to be like training your upper back.
Yes,
kind
exactly.
of for
That's a better
hypermobility.
way of
Okay.
looking at it. That's a better way of looking at it.
Okay.
Exactly. Upper back. Back in general, a lot of people are scared to train their back. We have so many muscles in our back.
Love training. I love how it looks when you train your back. You look really cool.
That's a bonus points.
Yeah.
Exactly. Core strengthening is important, don't get me wrong, but the world has made it seem like if you have a weak core, you're going to have back pain and you're going to have all these issues. It doesn't work like that. Our body pain is multifactorial. It's always going to be more than one thing. It's not as simple as just strengthen your core. But core stability and core strength is important for this population, especially when we are usually relying on our back structure too much because we can. It's good to be able to feel the engagement of your core, which a lot of this population struggles with as well. And then glute strength is huge.
Why is glute strength so important for hypermobile?
Our glutes are they're our biggest lower extremity muscle, and they're just a big muscle, and we rely on them a lot. But a big part of this too is our pelvis, and there's a lot of pelvic instability in this population as well, meaning the ligaments that attach your pelvis to the rest of your body may be too loosey-goosey and have too much laxity. That is going to require, this is also why we see a lot of pelvic floor issues in this population, your pelvic floor to get really, really tight. And then we also see a lot of glute clenchers in this population because they're trying to provide the stability that their pelvis can't. And so that's part of the reason why we need strong glutes. But I think everybody needs strong glutes. I think we should all just get strong glutes in general. But this population specifically really benefits from that.
And then also maybe posterior chain, like your hamstrings.
So calves is actually
my calves is that why my calves have zero muscle tone?
Yeah, so if your knees hyperextend especially, you're putting a lot of load and pressure on that area, especially when you probably didn't realize you were hyperextending your knees and have been doing that for your entire life. Your calves are now constantly in one position for too long. They can't handle being in the same position for that long period of time. No muscle can. And so they can become very, very tight. And we also see like shin pain in this population being higher as well, kind of the same but opposite reason. But I would also say hamstring strength is really important because most of us have very flexible hamstrings. And so we like to just use them to our advantage, but we don't actually strengthen or feel tension in our hamstrings. The most common thing I see is when people are doing RDLs is they don't feel them in their hamstrings.
Never.
Because they have so much mobility and flexibility in their hamstrings, and they're not actually going through their full range of motion in a controlled way. We may need to elevate them to allow that to happen. Again, this goes back to the long arms actually. But yeah.
Are the long arms
rampage?
No, I love it. Are the long arms why I look like fake tall in pictures?
Yeah, yes. And the long arms are actually on the diagnostic criteria, which we haven't talked about.
That's so funny. You got to measure my arms after this. Okay. Pelvic floor. I'm not even gonna get into that. I'm just gonna have a pelvic floor therapist on the thing. But I will say that like I have such a tight pelvic floor that when I have to pee, I need to like actually hold on to the like sink next to me and put pressure on it so that I can make the pressure go somewhere else to relax my pee muscles. Yeah. That's the only way I will pee. It takes me so long because I have to sit there and be like, okay, we're going to get these to relax. All right, I got to like press here and then I can relax it. It is like excruciating. And it's also why I can't do like colonics because my pelvic floor is so tight that it's so painful for me to release. And I often can't even release. So if that is you, just know this is part of this picture. It could be a pelvic floor issue. You're not weird. And I'm sorry that's happening to you because I know it sucks.
Yes. And it's more common than I think girls should talk about this more because I think we all experience pelvic floor stuff and just don't talk about it. It's more common than you realize, and it's not weird if you're dealing with stuff like that. Go find a pelvic floor physical therapist.
On the topic of calves really quick too, you were saying to me earlier that the most important thing people with hypermobility / POTS / all the things can do every day is calf raises. Why and how should we be doing them for maximum?
So the why, there's a couple reasons. One, if your knees hyperextend, having strong calves is going to help your entire system in general just be more stable and stronger.
How do we know if our knees hyperextend? When we stand, should we be looking for something?
Yeah, so I don't, can I stand up? Well,
I think you could just kind of like describe it. You know what? Let's have people Google knee hyperextension.
That's
when
a great
standing.
idea. That's a great
Just
idea.
Google that right now
Google
while
that,
you're listening. It's when instead of standing straight up and having like normal person knees, your knees kind of go back in like a
bow and arrow. Yeah.
A little bow and arrow situation. Yeah. Your knees go backwards and then you see like the calf curve.
Exactly. And the second is blood flow. So the easiest way to get blood back to our brain is ankle pumps. And so adding calf raises as your movement break is, in my opinion, one of the biggest game changers for this population. Just set an alarm. We should all be moving every hour. We should not be staying in one position for longer than an hour.
Like how we just did?
Yeah, like how we just did.
Cool.
Do 10 to 20 ankle pumps as your movement break. It gets blood up to your brain and you'll probably feel a little bit better.
When you say 10 to 20 ankle pumps, is this just standing flat on the floor and just going on your tippy toes and coming down?
So there's a lot of different ways we can do this. You can do them seated. And if that's all you can do, that's enough. That's okay. And a lot of this population does struggle with standing and doing movement at certain levels of the condition. So doing them seated is enough. If you are doing them standing, you want to make sure that we are not using our hypermobility and kind of winging out in them. And so putting a little ball and squeezing that ball can be really helpful. The biggest thing is going slow with them. So I like to say count to 6 on the way up, hold for 3 at the top, count to 6 on the way down, because this population likes to speed through things and use their mobility to their advantage. So the biggest, most important piece of this is actually the tempo at which you're doing them. But when you get to that advanced level, if you will, you can also do them elevated, but you want to make sure that you are not winging out and just not getting the most out of the exercises you want. And I want to preface this that there is no like good or bad movement. This is just, I'm trying to generalize things. We can't really generalize things, but these are majority of the population will benefit from.
Wow, that's just so helpful to know that every hour, if you just stand up and do slow calf raises and just like move those toes a little bit, you can pump blood to your brain. You can reduce flares. You can just like condition your tissues, help yourself stand better and have better posture. That's such a simple thing that this population can do. And I think I'm going to start officially. I'm
going to hold you accountable to that. And on that note too, like movement breaks in general or movement snacks, whatever you want to call them, everybody should be doing that, not just the hypermobile population. Nobody should be staying in one position for longer than an hour. Take movement breaks throughout your day. I guarantee you'll feel a little bit better.
Okay. I love that so much. And the last thing I just want to touch on, we didn't really talk a lot about the nervous system, but the nervous system
is a big part of this.
Plays a key role in hypermobility in the sense that hyperextending a joint when you are hypermobile and symptomatic can cause an inflammatory response within your nervous system. Like we said, anxiety, depression, all the things. But likewise, nervous system overactivation and dysfunction where you are immensely stressed and overpacking your schedule and staring at a screen for too long and all the things that can make your nervous system tick can also create problems within the picture of hypermobility. Why is that? And where does the nervous system come in, especially when managing flares?
Yeah. So again, a lot of different reasons, but the biggest one, dysautonomia, is your autonomic nervous system having a malfunction, if you will. The vagus nerve is also going to be a big part of this and a bigger picture in this. But everybody is going to have a different reason for why their nervous system is specifically impacting them. But a very generalized theme that we see is that we are usually oversympathetic, meaning we're constantly in fight or flight, and we struggle to get into the parasympathetic state. We struggle to rest and digest. And doing very simple nervous system regulation tactics, which I don't love that word, but it's an easy word to say, can go a long way. And what I'm talking about is humming, gargling water.
Is that why
belly
singing
breathing.
is so helpful?
Yes, singing's the best. It's the
Dude.
best. It's the best.
Okay. I'm so sorry to cut you. Humming.
Gargling water, belly breathing, or some form of breath work in general can be really, really helpful. Tapping, like butterfly tapping or anything tapping in general can be really, really helpful. Those are the 4 that I usually give. They're easy. You can do them anywhere.
What is butterfly tapping?
Just this.
Literally just taking
this.
your hands in an X pattern on your chest.
And you can do some belly breaths while you're at it. Maybe hum too.
We got to get back to like gathering around fires and singing together.
Yes, I agree with that. I totally
into that
agree with
vibe.
that. I love that.
That's the next era.
Yes, I love it. And a lot of this has to do too with the mast cells. And I know you're going to be talking about that with Michelle as well. But mast cells and nervous system regulation go hand in hand. And when you're super histamine, is that a word? Histamine?
Sure.
It
We're
can
making
be.
it a word.
Okay. You will feel very similar to someone who is experiencing anxiety. You're going to feel like heightened, and you're going to feel like your stomach just dropped, and you might be sweating. And a lot of the times we sweat peripherally. We're not sweating centrally or things like that.
Yeah. Just like the armpit sweat's coming out of nowhere, but no other pore is open.
Yep.
Wow. All right. So I love those nervous system techniques. I love everything you said today. I'm going to have to digest a bit of this. Obviously, I want you to tell us how we can work with you and all the beautiful things that you're working on. But before you do that, can you just tell us like what kind of a practitioner someone should be looking for if they're listening?
And this is so important. So the EDS Society, if you go to their website, they have a list of practitioners that work with this population. That's a great place to look. And it's like sectioned by area. You can also find this on my website, on my resource page as well. Disautonomia International also has a very good database of practitioners. But I recommend everybody in this population to ask their care team and their practitioners, do you know what EDS is? Have you worked with an EDS patient before? What was the outcome? And what did you change about the treatment plan because they had EDS? Because every single healthcare professional, there is going to be a change in the treatment plan if EDS is a part of the picture. And if they can't answer those 4 questions, in my opinion, find a different practitioner.
And who's the practitioner? Remind us that we're going to get the diagnosis of hypermobile EDS.
Yeah, so I don't think we even dived into this. So how you get a HEDS diagnosis. And so first, let's do some definitions. So there's hypermobile spectrum disorder, and there's hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. And then there's also 12 other types of Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. You're going to a practitioner, maybe it's a chiropractor, maybe it's a physical therapist, maybe it's an occupational therapist, and they say, you're pretty bendy. I think you're hypermobile. They have the ability to fill out the first and second part of the diagnostic checklist for HEDS. What that looks like is the first part is something called the Baton scale, which is a quick screening tool for generalized joint hypermobility. They can also use something called the 5PQ, which you don't actually have to put your patient through any movements. It's just questions. And sometimes those movements can be aggravating for people. And I think more clinicians should be using the 5PQ. We're starting to see them use it more, which is exciting as well. After that, the second part is broken into 3 sections. The first section is the list of 12 systemic questions. Believe it or not, having long arms is on there. And if you have 5 out of those 12, you pass that part. You need 2 out of the 3 on the second part. The second part is, do you have a family member who is diagnosed with this? The third part is, are you in chronic pain? Basically, that's what the third part is. And then that is all a physical therapist, chiropractor, or OT can do. They will then send that paper. Your PCP can also do those first 2 as well. Any doctor can do those first 2. Let me be clear, but most won't. Then they take that paper, and any doctor can do this part. But if you're in the US, I'm only speaking about the US healthcare system, they won't, and you're going to waste your time. I recommend sending it to a geneticist to get a connective tissue panel specifically to rule out all the other types of EDS. If all of those, as well as different autoimmune disorders that mimic EDS, like RA or lupus, also need to be ruled out. That is how you then get the clinical diagnosis of HEDS.
Got it.
Now, what may happen is you go to a geneticist and they don't want to run a connective tissue panel because they don't think it's necessary, and they give you a diagnosis of HSD, hypermobile spectrum disorder. I want it to be very, very clear. HSD is not less severe than HEDS, and they should be treated exactly the same as of right now in time. Once the gene for HEDS comes out, that will be different. But as of right now, every clinician should be treating HEDS and HSD the same.
Okay. And the person, like you said, who can then treat it is usually a PT, an OT, a chiropractor, someone who's doing some sort of like manual body work / also advising on strategies for strength training and nervous system dysregulation and like daily life tools.
Yeah. So I'm a big proponent for creating a care team when we're dealing with a systemic disorder like a connective tissue disorder. And somebody on your care team should be a musculoskeletal clinician. So somebody like you just described, as well as everybody with HEDS or a connective tissue disorder should see a cardiologist to just rule out the big, bad, and scary, because you are at a higher predisposition to certain cardiac disorders if you have a connective tissue disorder. So it's good to get an echocardiogram.
So do you just walk into a cardiologist's office and say, hey, I have a connective tissue disorder. I want to be screened with an echocardiogram?
I wish it worked like that. You walk into your PCP, you tell your PCP to send you to the cardiologist.
Got it. Okay.
Yep.
Okay.
And then, like I said, majority of this population has some sort of GI distress. So working with an RD or working with somebody in that space is imperative, in my opinion. And then a lot of this population needs a good neurologist as well if they're dealing with any sort of dysautonomia, as well as a lot of other comorbidities that live in the neurology world. I would say those are like the 4 non-negotiables.
Damn, better have some good insurance.
Yeah, that's a bigger conversation for a different day.
Jeez, but I mean, good to know that the providers are out there, especially if this is your thing. If this is your thing, this is where you go.
100%.
You go full managing it this way.
100%.
And making this like your life, where you're like, okay, this is my body.
And I like to break this up into sections too, because it can feel really overwhelming, and you don't have to do everything all at once. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. You can do it bits and pieces. And I like to personally, I structure my year where I do it in quarters, and I have one quarter where I'm really focusing on my health, because it becomes a lot when you have to go through all of these different testings and see all of these doctors, and there's medical gaslighting put into it as well. And so that's something that's been really helpful for me. I don't know if it will help everybody, but having a designated amount of time where I'm getting all of my appointments in and makes it feel less overwhelming.
Okay, so you're like seeing the cardiologist once a year.
Exactly.
At the same time that you're getting a checkup with these other care providers. It doesn't mean you have to be working with a neurologist every week.
Exactly.
It means that once a year, go to this neurologist so that they can check for what, like blood vessel, brain stuff? So the neurologist specifically is going to be, there's a lot of different comorbidities, a neurologist, a lot of them has to do with the neck, but in general, with dysautonomia in general, getting different treatment strategies, there's certain medications that can be helpful, certain medication changes, things like that. Okay. Gotcha.
With that being said, for the MSK practitioners, I did create a course to teach chiropractors, occupational therapists, and physical therapists how to work with this population. So that's also on my website.
Oh, we're putting a link to that right away. What is the course called?
It's called the Hypermobility Mastery Program.
So any practitioner who is a musculoskeletal practitioner, OTs, PTs, again, chiropractors, massage therapists, or
not yet?
Okay,
that hopefully soon. But as of right now, chiropractors, physical therapists, and occupational therapists.
Unbelievable! That's amazing, Taylor. Thank you for that resource.
Yeah.
And how can people work with you and any other offerings you have?
Yeah. So chiropractors in general, whether you want to work in the hypermobile space or not, Clinical Concepts is a great mentorship program where we teach chiropractors how to be more evidence-based, like we were talking about at the beginning. I get to be a mentor for that, which I love. And then the Hypermobility Mastery Program is for MSK clinicians who want to work in the hypermobile space. And then I work virtually with clients one-on-one. I call it hypermobility coaching, where we go through flare tracking and we get you back to exercise. It's very exercise focused and driven. And then lastly, the Honey Badger Project, which is for physical therapists, really anybody in healthcare who wants to break out of the healthcare system that we're currently trapped in the insurance-based models, and maybe go hybrid or virtual with their practice. And it completely changed my life.
I like want to cry right now because I can't believe you're only 28 and you're like helping people in this way. And like, you know this much and you've done this much and you're advocating for people like this and working so hard to create resources and training other practitioners to like actually see and witness and support these people. So thank you. Thanks for being on the podcast.
Thanks. Stop. Don't make me cry. Don't make me cry.
Thank you.
I did my makeup today. We can't have it watery.
All right. You'll find that in the show notes. Love you guys. Thanks for listening. Wasn't that great?